Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tech2 Science Podcast, the Earth, Space, and the Human Race. I'm Kavya,
And I'm Abigail.
and in this third episode, we're speaking to two experts, a climate change communicator and a researcher in urban resilience, about whether we need to build societies and cities that can withstand the impacts of climate change.
So, joining us today is Ruhie Kumar, a climate change communication strategist, and Aditya Bahadur, who is a principal researcher in climate resilient urban development with the International Institute of Environment and Development.
All right, so let's jump right in. Ruhi, we've all been told that each of us leaves our own little footprint behind, be it in the form of carbon emissions or plastic waste, leaving the light on or the tap running. How many of these issues are actually linked to what we are calling the climate change emergency? Is there any kind of helpful rule of thumb you can share with us as to what are the real things that we do as individuals that add to this bigger umbrella under climate change?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Kavya. I think the key point there is that we need to remember individual actions and bigger systemic changes, and how those two are interlinked and contributing together to the bigger climate change crisis, or what is also known as the climate emergency in quotes. Um, I think one of the key points is to understand that while we can do individual changes, it's also important to make sure or look for bigger systemic changes when you're talking about emissions. So if you're talking about transport emissions, which is like a big, big topic that goes on, or even industrial emissions, and in terms of what's contributing to the global climate change crisis, it's necessary to understand that the systemic change and individual change action is symbiotic. Unless people start demanding for it, the industries are not going to comply. And similarly, unless the industries are pulled up, individuals won't have wider choices to make to get into more clean, sustainable, renewable forms of energy, as well as daily consumption patterns. So I think it's a two-way street.
Yeah, so I fully agree with Ruhi that tackling the problem systemically is hugely important. And we need a mixture of both top down policy, systemic pushes. But I also feel that equally important is bottom up actions from individuals like ourselves. And since you asked for a rule of thumb, I think there are three things that I try and follow in my daily life. I try and consume as little as possible, and I think that's really important for all of us. Think twice about buying a third pair of jeans. Think twice about running a washing machine with only a couple of t-shirts in it. Remember that small little actions like shutting the tap off while brushing can make a huge difference. For instance, doing that, you end up using only 20% of the water that you would if the tap was running. So consumption is at the core of being a good steward of this world that we inhabit. I also try and consume as closely as possible, which is try and consume things that are grown around you, because miles embedded in things we order or things we eat are a huge source of climate emissions. And thirdly, the third rule of thumb would be to consume as sustainably as possible. Try and buy things that can be used again for different things. Try and source materials that are recycled, and try and source materials that can be recycled in the future. So I think consuming as little as possible, consuming as closely as possible, and consuming as sustainably as possible are three rules of thumb that we all can follow.
Yeah, that's definitely some good tips to kind of ensure that we are being responsible, where climate change is concerned.
Especially shopping local, like always you're counting your food miles. I think that's one of the bigger things. Yeah, I've heard about that. Okay.
And the interesting part about that is that I think most people don't understand that how many miles, kilometers your food is traveled. Things are being marketed as that this avocado from Peru has arrived at your doorstep. But do you
Yeah.
really need a from an avocado from the land of like Peru, right?
Yeah.
Can There are things available for a seasonal basis for a reason in India, and consuming that what is provided in a particular season makes sense nutritionally as well as from the point of view of sustainability in the long term.
Right. How can you also go into why that is better for us nutritionally? I don't think a lot of us know. I myself am quite
Yeah.
unaware of.
So no, that's a really good point, because I feel that let's, like, if you just wanted to rewind a good 40 years back and imagine speaking to your grandmother and asking them that tinde ki sabzi kab banti thi, right? Or when was the saag made in a year? They will give
Yeah.
you a specific time of the year, that it was the winter of 1975 or something. I'm just giving you an example in a
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
And I think that's really crucial, because the saag should be only available in the winter because it's a winter produce, and
Mhm.
hence this need to consume everything all the time has resulted into a demand that puts this pressure on farmers as well as the entire production line, supply chain,
Mhm.
logistics, your supermarkets, to give you items all through the year, which you may necessarily not require it. And I think it's the privileged class and the conscious consumer who can go out and say, I do not want to eat an Alfonso mango in November. No, thank you very much. I'd like to enjoy that Alfonso mango ice cream in May, because that's when it's supposed to be available. And
Right.
if you want this produce to come in a separate season, it requires a heavy load of chemical fertilizer, pesticides, and genetically modified seeds that would then result in another horde of its own problems that you've created.
And also,
I
like,
think it's
making
yeah.
sure that food is nutritious when it travels from further away requires a lot of energy, right? Like, for example, maintaining the cold chain of fruits that come from, as Ruhi rightly said, from Peru. All that needs energy, which is really harmful for the environment in the long term.
I think also another follow up to that. I'm curious to know if people do not want to give up that, but still be a little responsible. Is there a solution that we don't have right now to meet that kind of demand? Uh, Vertical farming, for instance, may be a little less energy intensive, but perhaps if there was a way to culture or grow these plants without really sabotaging the environment, is there something that can be done? Are there any solutions to being a little ambitious with your appetite and wanting exotic things without really causing any harm?
I think in India, we're still quite a way away from proving these high technology farming approaches at scale. In the West, of course, like in New York, big corporations have got engaged in rooftop farming, which is reaping rich dividends. But at the moment, I think in India at least, we're a bit far away from that. But certainly, it's something that the government needs to consider more carefully. Having said that, I think that also has an environmental impact, right? You may need technologies to ensure that water is pumped up many floors, up to the rooftops of various buildings, that temperature is maintained, etc., etc. So yes, I mean, if you're that is possible, but I think, as Ruhi rightly said, consuming locally and sustainably can never be beaten in terms of its ecological benefits, and high-tech solutions can only go that far.
So, in India, we've been seeing a bunch of environmental issues like poor air quality, wildfires, and extreme weather events that have a direct impact on our lives and our health and our well being. And we've also been seeing a lot of stories in recent times about making societies more resilient to these impacts. So, what does resilience mean when it comes to the environment?
Sure. So yeah, resilience simply means the ability of a system like a city to withstand shocks and stresses emanating from climate change, or actually could be any other source of shocks and stresses. And it basically boils down into three things. It means that cities should slowly adapt to a changing climate. So, for instance, people planning cities need to recognize that as climate change progresses, sea levels are going to rise, and therefore building critical infrastructure like roads or factories or power stations right on the coast is not as good an idea as people previously thought. So we need to change the way in which we plan and adapt to the slow onset impacts of climate change. We also need to anticipate the impacts of climate change better, and this requires early warning systems. For instance, now in Paris, they had a catastrophic heat wave about 15 years ago, in which hundreds of people died. And since then, they've developed very robust systems to anticipate heat waves that are about to come using satellite data and ground sensors. 7 days before a heat wave, all the hospitals and clinics and other emergency services in Paris are alerted that a heat wave is going to come. Certain Indian cities like Ahmedabad are also making progress towards that. So we need to anticipate disasters and shocks better. And finally, our people living in cities need to have the ability to absorb these shocks and stresses should our mechanisms of anticipating and adapting fail. So government should put in place mechanisms where cash is given to disaster affected people and safety nets are built for victims of disasters in urban and in rural areas. So the capacity to adapt, anticipate, and absorb shocks and stresses together makes up a comprehensive approach to being resilient to the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add on the resilience bit that I think some recent example would be the super cyclone Amphan that struck the eastern coast of India, and how it's a proven fact that the mangroves in Sundarbans played a critical role in reducing the impact of that cyclone. There's been multiple scientific reports as well as analysis post the impact of the cyclone, and that's a very good learning that there is the human side of it, the impact of human beings, and there is the impact on biodiversity and natural habitat and biodiversity, right? So in case of Mumbai as well, there's been some movement in looking at afforestation of mangroves because it's largely a reclaimed city. And it's been reclaimed to such an extent in some parts of like New Mumbai and even leading to some suburbs that now it has sort of the rains inundate every single year. You look at the flood news and you know that every year Mumbai is going to get flooded, and there are these 2-3 like peaks of city floods that happen. And as Aditya mentioned, there's like a lot of lack of good climate resilient city planning, but also that that city planning needs to incorporate things like looking at wetlands, mangroves, and the systems that can actually help absorbing more water in cities, in our coastal cities especially.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Ruhi. I think what we call nature-based solutions or environment-based solutions are massively overlooked when we're trying to build resilience of cities. And most of the time, the government prefers hard infrastructure like dikes and dams that may be useful in the short term, but because the environment is changing so rapidly, may not be so useful over the long term because we don't know how the environment is going to change. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned Amphan because there's a growing recognition that cities need to be resilient to multiple different shocks and stresses at the same time. As Amphan was about to hit Odisha, the government suddenly realized that 25% of the cyclone shelters that they had built precisely to deal with an impact such as that from a cyclone like Amphan were being used as quarantine centers for COVID-19. So cities are
Right.
facing these different kinds of disasters that and have to be dealt with comprehensively and holistically.
So, is it possible for when you're to incorporate all these changes in a city that's already been built? Because we're always facing space constraints, and when you look at how the options between housing or having these, like you said, storm shelters or whatever, people usually will go for housing. So, is it possible to actually incorporate them in cities that have already been built?
It is possible to absolutely take action once cities have been built, and you can do simple things like, for instance, I did a lot of work in Gorakhpur at one point of time, which suffers from waterlogging, which is for people who are not from India and listening to this podcast, it's low level, high frequency flooding that can be catastrophic for people's lives and livelihoods. And the reason why there's so much water logging in Gorakhpur is because garbage is getting into drains. So you don't need a massive new engineering solution to prevent floods. You don't need a dam to be built on the river that goes past Gorakhpur to prevent that. All you need is good solid waste management, and you can really solve more than 60% of the flooding problem in Gorakhpur. So sometimes these low cost, low hanging actions, cities that have already been built, can be great. But of course, if one has the opportunity to design a city from scratch that is climate resilient and sustainable, that would be great. And it's important to remember that most of the cities that are going to exist in developing countries like India in 2050 are yet to be built. Right, cities such as Delhi are expanding at 4% per annum. So new neighborhoods, new suburbs, the next Gurgaon, the next Noida are still to be built, and there's a great opportunity for people to make sure that this new development takes on board the principles of climate resilient planning. And I think a good starting point would be listening to this podcast.
Well put.
Fully agree with that. I just another thing to add there. Concretization of roads and concretization of sideways and walkways is something that is largely accepted as a common way of building communities. Like if you go to any gated community in metropolitans, you see that, and then you wonder like what existed before they paved that into concrete, right? And these are very small things, but these are the things that planners need to keep in account, that while you are giving it like this new look and making it more palatable for a certain kind of economic class, you cannot lose the natural the landscape of the area. In my own area in Thane, I find it really hard to understand that there is this waterlogging every year, and if only there was less concrete on the pathways, I can guarantee you that there would be more water absorbed by this entire area. And that's effectively because literally imagine you have a sponge and you've put like a layer of concrete on that. So obviously there's no way that it's going to seep through it, because the soil is like sponge, and places in like Navi Mumbai, especially the wetlands and the mangroves, they really do absorb a lot of water, and that's their role. But if you cover it with something or you dredge it too much by construction, it is going to have a backlash, which is inundation. So there are these solutions that need to be kept in mind during the very basic planning, not something that, you just wake up, on one of those euphoria moments and be like, "Aaj hum climate change ko solve karenge."
So it's a combination of multiple things that are much smaller, but not really one big thing that will apply to all in terms of resilience. It's usually
Always.
a pretty
Yes,
local and
but Kavya,
unique problem.
just to add, I
Yeah.
agree with you that the individual actions will be contextually tailored. But there are certain principles that cut across what you're trying to do, right? And I think if we go back, we have to give towns and cities the ability to anticipate, absorb, and adapt to these changes over the long term.
Yeah.
But we're just seeing a lot of these changes happening very quickly. We don't have that time actually to, adapt and kind of figure out what's happening. It's happening right now, and it's happening right this very minute. So how do you deal with that? Like that's quick. Like, is there an instant solution or something that will help for now?
You have to be clear that there is no silver bullet, right? Um, it's I know policymakers and people who are making decisions and government don't want to hear this, but the situation is complex. There is no vaccine that can be invented to solve climate change, right? Putin is not going to make a declaration tomorrow saying there's one single solution has been released. So, but I feel like existing ways of managing risk need to be disrupted. You guys are tech bloggers, and disruptive technology has become ubiquitous. And I feel we need disruptive resilience. The manner in which our cities have conceptualized ways of dealing with shocks and stresses is not in tune with the kind of upheaval that we are now facing. And we need shifts in a few domains. I'll give you a few quick examples, right? Usually, risk management is quite top down. Government goes in, says we're going to solve this problem. government agencies goes in. But we've seen that that hasn't been really effective, and we need to really partner with people who are on the front lines of risk. What happened during COVID-19 in Dharavi? The only way the virus was contained in Dharavi was because the government took a different approach. They partnered with local doctors, they partnered with local nurses, local community based organizations, recruited volunteers from within Dharavi to do testing and behavior change and awareness building from door to door. And when they started treating communities who are at risk as part of the solution rather than treating them as the problem, the whole situation changed. As a result of which, I mean, I was shocked to learn the statistic that not a single sanitation worker working within Dharavi got infected by COVID-19 because local organizations developed a network of sanitation workers and gave them PPE kits. And the government supported these organizations in doing that. So treat people at risk, especially those who are poor and living in informal settlements and slums, as part of the solution. Second issue is we need a new approach to thinking about data. Big data, and I'm sure you guys know much more about this than I do. Big data can really be useful in understanding risk. And I think there's a little window of opportunity here with COVID-19, with contact tracing. Governments have embraced contact tracing, and similar applications exist for understanding which people are impacted by climate change. For instance, experiments carried out in Bangladesh, Europe, and Latin America now prove that pinging off people's cell phone is a very effective way of understanding who lives in the path of a hurricane or who lives in a flood affected area. Previously, gathering this data was really difficult. Third,
Yeah.
we need to really a new approach to thinking about finance. Our cities can no longer rely on international climate finance from the World Bank or these international institutions to deal with these risks, as Abigail, as you rightly say, that happen very quickly and are exigent and emergent problems. You put in an application to the World Bank for funding to build resilience in a city. It will be at least 5 years before the first dollar hits the city's bank account. So we need to give the city the abilities to generate their own financing. And municipal bonds are particularly important in this context. A few weeks ago, the Federal Reserve in America announced that they're going to buy $500 billion worth of municipal bonds from cities in America to give them the ability to respond to COVID-19. Similarly, we need a new approach to innovation, and we really need to give the ability of people running water, transport, energy, waste management systems in these cities the ability to make decisions under times of uncertainty.
These impacts, like Abigail mentioned earlier, there's environmental impacts and extreme weather, more air pollution. A lot of these things are now starting to affect a lot of cities as well as rural areas. And is there anything about India specifically that makes us more vulnerable, whether it's population, whether it's our policies? Is there anything about India that makes us more vulnerable to these kinds of impacts, these changes in the environment we're seeing?
There are particular aspects of India that make us very vulnerable, right? The first thing is we have a massive coastline. And at least when it comes to climate change and what we call hydrometeorological disasters, people living along the coast are very exposed to these different shocks and stresses. So the longer the coastline, the more risk the country faces. Second major problem in India is poverty. Uh, 60% of the people in our country earn less than $3.5 a day, which is the medium poverty line according to the World Bank, and 20% earn less than $2 a day. So our population is very poor, and if they're impacted by any of these shocks and stresses, don't have the adequate ability to bounce back and absorb these shocks. So it's a mixture of being exposed to these disasters and being inherently quite vulnerable to these disasters. That is a problem for India. And of course,
Yeah.
I also think the rapid rate of urbanization in India is a challenge because there are specific aspects of cities that make them more vulnerable to different kinds of shocks and stresses than non-urban areas.
I was actually going to say that cities are more resilient, but I think Aditya just said that's not true. But I guess it's better to when a city is hit by one of the climate change impacts. It's, I think, easier for us to deal with that in a city than it is to deal with it in a village, because cities are more they're more well connected, and you can get resources from uh, from place to place more easily. But how do you how do experts plan to make cities and even villages, not let's not forget villages at all, how do you make them more resilient in uh, to face these changes?
Sure. So I think first, when it comes to cities, uh, cities are more dense than non-urban areas, right? I mean, that's a very simple point. And what density leads to is a very small little disturbance becoming a big disaster. You know, a little flood in a neighborhood becomes a cholera outbreak because people are so densely packed together. Second thing is that cities are quite complex when it comes to governance and management. You know, there are different government agencies, departments, ministries with overlapping functions, trying to do the same thing, and there's a transaction cost for them coordinating effectively to manage a particular disaster. I mean, I'm currently based in Delhi. The overlap between what the municipal corporation of Delhi has to do and what the state government of Delhi does is so confusing, and it takes so much effort to make sure that they're coordinating effectively that can be a problem. But Abigail, you're right. Like if harnessed well, these two characteristics of cities can also be a big opportunity for managing risk better. So the fact that cities are dense, that means you can really get support to people who need it quite quickly because they're quite, in a similar geographic area. The fact that cities have diverse ministries and departments with overlapping functions means that they already have quite a lot of capacity and governance infrastructure in place to deal with these risks. So if it's managed well, the density and complexity of cities can either be a challenge or an opportunity. But I think pertaining to the second part of your question on the ingredients of climate resilient planning, uh, there are a whole range of functions, but broadly, I think it boils down into five things. We need good quality data. We need to understand how different kinds of disasters and shocks and stresses will impact cities or are impacting cities already. We need to engage with people who are most at risk, and these are by far people living in slums and informal settlements effectively. We need to ensure that planning processes in cities take climate change into account. We need to make sure that people running cities or running the critical transport, energy, water, waste management systems understand what climate change is and can deal with the impacts of climate change so that through training and capacity building. And five, we need the right kind of finance in order to build resilience. And I touched upon this a few minutes ago.
These 5 points that you mentioned, can they also be kind of tweaked a little bit to go to be used for villages as well? Because I mean, they also face these kind of these problems as well, right? And we constantly, I think we kind of forget about them, and we when we're talking
Yeah.
about climate change. But I think they kind of face it even more, and they face the brunt of it a bit more than maybe cities do, because we can bounce back.
If you're talking about a village, district, taluka, or tier 2, tier 3 city, right? What are the needs? Because there is no formula for a city. Every city is different, every village is different. Their needs are different, their requirements are different. It has to be a very customized plan that is created for that particular village, for example. And it's also very important that solutions are made with an oversight of a full cycle, like closing the loop, right? We can't just say that we will produce certain energy but not create means to distribute it. Then it kind of becomes a bit problematic, because you've created a solution but you've not really finished the entire lifespan of it. You must have heard of the what do we call that, last mile connectivity in urban mobility, right? Like if I'm going from my house to the office, I mean, when I did, I would take an auto, then take a bus, train, and then finally I would be at some station, and then I'm still 5 kilometers away from my office because there is no last mile connectivity, and I still am struggling to reach the office safely and in an affordable manner where I don't have to spend a lot of money. So I think last mile connectivity is a concept that's even missing in most of the implementation of a lot of policies in terms of for climate resilient planning, especially in smaller communities of villages or tier 2 and 3, because often there is an announcement like there'll be some new policy which is an aggregator of all the other policies, but the implementation and tracking, monitoring, then reevaluating and readapting it, that's a full cycle that's usually missing in terms of how these solutions can be adopted in the long term, not just in short term,
Yeah.
because climate resilience is nothing about short term. You can try with disruption, and that's really important. You need the
Yeah.
disruptive solutions, but you need
Yeah.
to have an oversight of the long term, because that's when you can actually plan. You can't plan without understanding what the community needs in terms of both like social needs, cultural needs, economic needs, all sorts of requirements.
Yeah, so I fully agree with Ruhi about the need for contextually relevant solutions. But I think, Abigail, you asked about villages particularly. I think the main difference there is that people's livelihoods are very sensitive to changes in the climate, because most people living in villages are farmers or do associated things, that are really dependent on air, water, temperature. And even small changes in these parameters can lead to devastation in their source of livelihood. So I think there are a few key things that the government can do. I think we really need safety net programs like Manrega, which is a lifeline for people, farmers whose crop might fail as a result of, a flood. At least there's some basic minimum guarantee of employment there. So social safety net programs like Manrega can be great. Farmers insurance programs that actually work is another thing that can be done. But I also feel that making sure that rural households are reliant on more than one type of livelihood activity is important. So if you're a farmer, government should ensure that yes, you may have a rice paddy, but you should also have a chicken coop. So if your rice paddy fails, you have another thing to fall back on, and then slowly ensuring that agricultural practice becomes a little more climate resilient.
Like Ruhi said, I think a lot of the fixes are not really a one-shot fix. They're often more of a lifestyle choice in common parlance, but also for policies as well. I think it needs a lot of fine-tuning and feedback, and eventually a strong system will grow out of that kind of closed circle.
And the reality is that until we figure out the solutions for communities in rural spaces, our city spaces are constantly going to be overloaded because of this massive problem of that single putting all the eggs in one basket livelihood model, right? If that fails, then the farmer has to move, and can you imagine the blow on a family's ego that they had this big land or they had open spaces, and they had a social status of a farmer they were providing, and they land up as construction workers living on the outskirts of city in shanty towns and being looked upon in a very sort of hostile manner from the rest of the city dwellers who are supposedly much higher in terms of like social structure from them. So it creates problems at many different layers, not just in the sense of just like they migrated. It has so many different repercussions which are more social than anything in nature, and hence climate change is often deemed to be a policy problem. It's not. It's embedded into everything right now, and it's highly intersectional. And to talk about climate change, one has to talk about all the other different things, like Aditya also mentioned about people living in the unorganized and informal sector and working there. So that's something that really needs to be kept in mind when we're talking about solution planning, both for cities or even for villages.
Do Indian societies, I think, know the answer to this, but do Indian societies as of today really need to incorporate changes and take this seriously if we want to cope with climate change? And if yes, what are the kind of timelines we are aiming for? This is a bit of a goal thing and not a realistic one, but like to really set the bar. What are the kind of timelines we're looking for to adopt these changes?
The thing to remember here is, unfortunately, that the poor people in India are not to blame at all for this. Their contribution to climate change at the national or international level is negligible. What they consume is so little that they're actually, serendipitously demonstrating a model for consumption, for sustainable consumption, because they're not consuming that much. So I don't think all of Indian society is to blame for it. And I don't think that the burden of action falls on the poorest. I think the rich people in India, all of us with our the use of Ubers and the SUVs parked in our garages and our three ACs running across our houses and our big refrigerators and our washing machines, the rich in India are the ones who need to think twice, who need a change in lifestyle, and who need to recognize that they're contributing to the problem. And I think we've discussed a number of solutions across this podcast. All of them are relevant. And I mean, I would again differ with you, Kavya. I think the time to take action is now. Every day, the world and India is exhausting its carbon budget. And it is the privileged people in the country who are consuming, traveling, and contributing to climate change that really need to change the way that they're behaving.
I agree with what Aditya said, that it's the rich people who have to change it. But I think we constantly also need to address that how uh, the aspiration levels of people in this country have been created by the mainstream media about what one must own, what one must wear, what one must eat, etc., in order to appear, in a certain trendy way. And to break that down will take some time, but there is also some really great new narratives that are being created around protecting the nature, and more like actually flipping that around and saying that it's not the nature that needs the protection, it's the human beings. The earth doesn't need to be saved, it's the human beings that need to really look after themselves and their own species, but without sort of plundering the entire planet. So yeah, I think the solutions are there. They are very much in people's minds. They need to be funded, they need to be researched, and hopefully they need to be combined with each other and not work in silos, because climate change, it's one of the problems where everything is connected. You cannot just like make separate circles and say this is how it's going to work.
If all the world's chimneys went silent today, we would still feel the impacts of all the carbon that has been emitted over the last few decades for many decades to come. So, building resilience and adaptation is absolutely essential. And for the first time in the history of the world, more people are living in cities than in rural areas. So, the battle for climate change will be won or lost in the world cities.
We've now reached the end of this podcast, and we've had a lovely, insightful conversation on what resilience means, what that looks like, how that differs in a variety of societies, all strata of societies in India. That's it. Thank you, and we hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye everyone.
That was it for this time. Join us next time where we'll be talking about whether universal healthcare is the right move for India in the post pandemic era. Until then, it's Abigail and Kavya signing off.